She was 24 years old, and by the time the sheriff's men finished nailing the notice to her door, she had nowhere left in the territory to call home. Her father, Ezra Colton, had died owing more to the Cactus Rim Land and Cattle Company than his modest homestead could ever repay, and the company's local manager, a clipped and colorless man named Reuben Sharp, had wasted no time informing Delphine Colton that the debt passed to her by law and that she had 1 week to vacate before the property reverted to company hands. In her carpetbag she carried $2.90, the last of what she'd earned selling her father's tools to a traveling tinker, and with it, she meant to buy herself some scrap of ground before the Arizona heat and the coming winter left her with nothing at all. What she found, standing skeletal and forgotten at the edge of a dry wash 3 miles from town, was an abandoned windmill, its blades rusted still, and its wooden tower silvered with age, sold to her for $2 by a land office clerk, glad to be rid of a worthless parcel no rancher wanted. Folks who watched her hand over nearly everything she owned for a broken windmill on barren ground called it the last foolish act of a grieving girl who had lost her senses along with her father. They did not know that tucked into the tower's highest rafters, wrapped and waiting for 11 long years, rested her own mother's final letter, one that would not only give Delphine Colton a reason to stay, but would settle a debt this whole valley had quietly carried since before she was old enough to understand what had truly happened to her mother. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Delphine Colton. If you have ever stood on ground everyone else called worthless, and felt, against all sense, that it still had something to give you, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Delphine had been born in the spring of 1869, in a sun-baked adobe house, at the edge of Cactus Rim, a scattering of ranches, and a single dusty main street in the Arizona Territory, where water was worth more than gold, and a family's whole fortune could depend on whether the well ran dry before the rains came. Her father, Ezra Colton, ran cattle on a modest spread at the valley's edge, a hard-working, taciturn man who measured his affection in labor rather than words, mending fences and hauling water long after other ranchers had given up for the day. Her mother, Eunice Colton, was the gentler half of that marriage, a woman with a gift for finding water where the land seemed to offer none, a talent she had learned, she always said, from her own mother back in Sonora, who had taught her to read the subtle language of desert plants. The particular green of a mesquite that grew too tall for its surroundings, the way certain grasses clustered where no rancher would expect them, signs that spoke, to a patient eye, of water moving quietly beneath the surface, where nothing above ground betrayed it. Ines used this gift generously throughout Delphine's early childhood, walking the dry washes and rocky flats around Cactus Rim with her young daughter in tow, teaching her to read the land the way another mother might teach reading from a book. And it was on one of these long, sun-drenched walks that Ines first showed Delphine the old windmill, standing forgotten at the edge of a wash 3 miles from their home, explaining that her own instinct told her water ran deep and steady beneath that particular stretch of ground, water that could, if properly drawn, transform the whole surrounding acreage from worthless scrub into something a family could actually farm. It was not idle talk. Ines Colton believed, with a conviction she rarely applied so forcefully to anything else, that the windmill and the water beneath it represented the valley's best hope for surviving the droughts that came, with grim regularity, every several years, and drove smaller ranchers to ruin. She spoke often, in the evenings on the porch, of a dream she carried for the whole community, not simply her own family's prosperity, but a shared irrigation system that could draw from that hidden water and spread it across dozens of struggling homesteads, easing the valley's dependence on a single unreliable creek that too many families competed over each summer. "Nothing given to the earth is ever truly wasted," she would tell Delphine, running her fingers through the girl's hair as they sat together, watching the sunset paint the desert gold. "Water finds its patient way to those who know how to look for it, and so does everything else worth having." Delphine absorbed this conviction more deeply than perhaps even her mother intended, carrying it forward into a quiet, watchful girlhood defined by careful attention to the land around her, an eye for what others too easily dismissed as barren or used up, whether it was a patch of ground, an old tool, or a person the town had already written off. Ines Colton died when Delphine was 13, thrown from a spooked horse while surveying the very land she had hoped, one day, to see irrigated and thriving. And her death struck the family and the valley alike, with a grief made sharper by how suddenly it came, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, with no warning at all. Ezra Colton, never a demonstrative man, even in the best of times, retreated further into silence after his wife's death, throwing himself into the punishing labor of the ranch, as though exhausting his body might somehow dull the loss. And Delphine, still a girl, learned to carry her grief privately, tending what remained of her mother's careful desert knowledge, the way one tends a small flame in wind, practicing the water-reading skills Ines had begun teaching her, walking the same washes alone in the years that followed, keeping her mother's dream of the windmill and its hidden water alive in her own private thoughts, even as the rest of the valley moved on, and largely forgot that Ines Colton had ever spoken of such plans at all. Her father never remarried, and never spoke much of Ines in the years that followed, though Delphine noticed, in small, unguarded moments, how his eyes sometimes drifted toward the direction of that particular wash when he thought no one was watching, and she came, slowly, to understand that her father's silence was not indifference, but a grief too large for him to safely put into words. Ezra taught her instead what he knew, the harder, more practical education of running cattle and keeping a modest ranch solvent through good years and lean ones alike. And Delphine grew into a capable young woman, known around Cactus Rim for her quiet competence, the kind of steady, unshowy reliability that neighbors came to depend on without quite remarking upon it, whether it was helping deliver a difficult calf or lending a hand during a neighbor's harvest. She believed, as most young people do, that the shape of her future had already settled into something predictable, that she would go on helping her father run the ranch, and perhaps, in time, marry and raise a family of her own on the only land she had ever known. She could not have imagined, in those quiet years of routine labor, how quickly and how completely that settled life was about to come apart. Ezra Colton died in the winter of 1893, felled by a lung sickness that had been creeping upon him for months before he finally admitted, too late, that he needed a doctor's care. And Delphine, 24 years old and unmarried, found herself not only grieving a second parent, but confronting a debt she had never known existed, a loan her father had quietly taken against the ranch some years before, from the Cactus Rim Land and Cattle Company, borrowed to see the family through a brutal drought year, and never fully repaid in the years since. Reuben Sharp, the company's local manager, called upon Delphine, within a fortnight of the funeral, precise and unfailingly polite, in the way of a man who considered courtesy a substitute for kindness rather than an expression of it, informing her that Arizona territory law held her responsible for her father's outstanding debts, and that since the ranch itself represented the company's only meaningful collateral, it would need to be sold to satisfy the note. He was not cruel in any dramatic sense. He simply treated the matter as a column of figures to be balanced, offering Delphine 1 week to vacate the property before company men arrived to take formal possession, and expressing, in the flattest possible terms, his regret that circumstances required it. Delphine did not argue, understanding that a grieving young woman with no standing and no money stood little chance against a company with lawyers and paperwork on its side, and she spent that final week doing what she could to salvage some scrap of a future from the wreckage, selling her father's tools and what remained of the small herd to a traveling tinker and a neighboring rancher for whatever fair price she could negotiate, setting aside every coin in a worn leather purse that held, by the time she packed her carpetbag and walked away from the only home she had ever known, precisely $2.90. She spent her first 2 nights in the spare room above the mercantile, offered by a sympathetic shopkeeper's wife who had known her mother, but understood within days that she could not depend on such charity indefinitely, in a town where most families were themselves stretched thin by drought and hard seasons. And so she began walking the dry country around Cactus Rim each morning, looking not for handouts, but for some overlooked scrap of ground she might claim outright, however unpromising it appeared to everyone else. It was on the fourth day of this searching, walking a path she had not deliberately chosen, but that her feet seemed to remember on their own, that Delphine found herself standing once again before the old windmill at the edge of the dry wash, the very spot her mother had shown her more than a decade before, its wooden tower, silvered gray with age and neglect, its great blades rusted motionless against the pale desert sky. She had passed this place occasionally over the years, without stopping, the ache of her mother's memory, too sharp to linger near it. But that morning, with nowhere else in the world to turn, she found herself studying the abandoned structure, the way her mother had once studied the land itself, looking past its ruin, for whatever quiet promise still lay beneath it. She walked into town and found the land office clerk, a thin, harried man named Otis Pruitt, who managed whatever county business the more established ranchers had no patience for, and asked him plainly what the county intended to do with an abandoned windmill parcel that had sat untaxed and unclaimed for over a decade. He told her, with the faint relief of a man glad to be rid of a nuisance line item, that if she had $2 and the willingness to take on a worthless plot of scrub that had defeated every rancher who'd ever tried to work it, he would draw up the deed himself before supper. Word traveled through Cactus Rim quickly, as it always did in so small a valley, and more than one neighbor shook their head at the sight of Ezra Colton's orphaned daughter, spending nearly everything she had left on a broken windmill and barren ground nobody else wanted, calling it, with more pity than scorn, the last desperate act of a girl too grieved to think clearly about her own future. The first days at the windmill were spent in the humbling, grounding work of making the place livable, and Delphine approached the labor the way her father had taught her to approach every hardship, without complaint, finding in the physical work itself a kind of steadiness that grief alone could never offer. She built a rough lean-to shelter against the base of the tower, using salvaged lumber and canvas, cleared brush and debris from around the structure's foundation, and began, driven by both practical need and a deeper pull she did not fully examine, to climb the weathered ladder rungs, bolted along the tower's interior, inspecting the old mechanism to see whether any part of it might still be coaxed back into working order. It was on her third climb, reaching the uppermost platform, just beneath the rusted blade assembly, that her hand brushed against something wedged tightly into the rafters, supporting the tower's small equipment housing, a shape too deliberate and too carefully placed to be ordinary debris. She worked at it carefully in the fading afternoon light, and after several minutes of patient effort, drew free a small oilskin packet, tied with cord gone brittle with age, tucked into a gap between two support beams, where it had clearly been hidden on purpose by someone who had wanted it kept safe, but never came back to retrieve it. Delphine sat on the narrow platform high above the desert floor for a long while before she found the courage to open it, some instinct already telling her, before she even loosened the cord, that whatever waited inside would matter more than she was prepared for. Inside, wrapped in a second layer of oiled cloth to guard against the desert's dust and heat, she found a single folded letter, the paper yellowed but remarkably well preserved, written in a hand she recognized instantly, and with a jolt that stole the breath from her chest. For it was her own mother's careful, looping script, a hand Delphine had not seen in 11 years, and had feared she might someday forget entirely. It took her the better part of that evening, climbing back down to her small lean-to, and reading by the light of a single candle, to work up the steadiness to read the letter in full, and what she found there unspooled a story far larger and more consequential than she had ever imagined her mother's private dream of irrigation to be. The letter, dated only 3 days before the horseback accident that took Ines Colton's life, was addressed to Delphine herself, written, Ines explained in its opening lines, to be read only if something should happen before she had the chance to see her plans through. A possibility, she confessed, she had begun to fear more seriously than she had ever let on to her husband. The letter described, in careful and increasingly urgent detail, that Ines had not simply guessed at water beneath the windmill site through instinct alone, but had spent the better part of 2 years secretly surveying the underground water table across the whole valley, using knowledge passed down from her own mother, combined with careful, patient observation, and had concluded that a substantial aquifer ran beneath a wide swath of cactus rimland, deep and steady enough, if properly accessed through this windmill and two others she had identified, to free the valley's smaller ranchers from their dependence on the unreliable creek that the valley's larger operations, chiefly the very cactus rimland and cattle company that would one day foreclose on her own daughter, had spent years quietly maneuvering to control through disputed water rights claims that smaller families lacked the resources to challenge. Ines wrote that she had taken her survey findings to the Territorial Land Office some months before her death, hoping to file a formal water rights claim in the name of the smaller ranching families collectively, a claim that would have protected their access permanently against the larger company's growing influence, but that her filing had been mysteriously delayed, then delayed again, and that she had begun to suspect, with the same careful, watchful instinct she brought to reading the desert itself, that someone within the land office was deliberately obstructing her claim, likely at the company's quiet urging, since a confirmed and protected aquifer beneath smaller family lands would substantially undermine the company's ongoing efforts to consolidate water rights across the valley through legal pressure and outright purchase of struggling homesteads. Fearing that her filing might be lost or destroyed before it could be properly recorded, Ines had made a duplicate copy of her full survey, along with a hand-drawn map marking the aquifer's boundaries and the exact locations of the 3 windmill sites best positioned to access it, and had hidden this copy in the one place she trusted completely, the rafters of the very windmill tower that sat at the heart of her survey, a place she visited often enough that discovery seemed unlikely, and safe enough, built of solid old timber, that the desert's heat and dust would do it little harm. She wrote that she intended to press the matter further with the territorial office, and, if necessary, to travel to the capital herself to see the claim properly filed, but that if anything should happen to her before she managed it, she wanted her daughter to know the truth of what she had found, and to finish, if she ever had the chance and the courage, what her mother had started. Delphine sat with the letter for a long while that night, the desert wind moving softly against the canvas of her makeshift shelter, understanding with a clarity that arrived slowly, and then all at once, that her mother's death, however accidental it had appeared at the time, had come at the precise moment she was preparing to challenge one of the most powerful interests in the valley, and that the very company, now holding Delphine responsible for her father's debt, was, according to her mother's own careful suspicions, the same company that may have quietly ensured Ines Colton's water claim never saw daylight. She could not know, and the letter did not claim to know, whether her mother's death had been anything but the tragic accident it appeared, and she resolved, even in the rawness of that first reading, not to let grief and suspicion curdle into an accusation she could not prove. But the survey itself, the map, the aquifer, these were facts a person could act upon, regardless of what had or had not happened to the woman who discovered them, and Delphine understood, sitting alone on the desert floor with her mother's handwriting trembling slightly in the candlelight, that she had been handed, quite by accident, the very thing her mother had died trying to deliver to the valley's struggling families. Cactus Rim in 1893 had, in the 11 years since Ines Colton's death, watched the Cactus Rim Land and Cattle Company grow steadily into the valley's dominant force, buying up struggling homesteads at a fraction of their worth, whenever a bad drought year forced smaller ranchers into debt they could not escape, a pattern that had, Delphine now realized with a cold clarity, claimed her own family's land through precisely the mechanism her mother had feared. Reuben Sharp, the company's local manager who had so briskly foreclosed on Delphine's ranch, reported to a regional director named Cornelius Ashby, a man rarely seen in Cactus Rim itself, but whose influence touched nearly every significant transaction in the valley, and it was Ashby, Delphine came to understand through careful, quiet inquiry over the following weeks, who had personally overseen the company's long campaign to consolidate water rights across the region, a campaign that depended entirely on smaller ranchers remaining unable to prove any secure claim to water beyond the contested creek the company already substantially controlled. Delphine did not rush to file her mother's survey publicly, understanding, with an instinct sharpened by grief and necessity alike, that a company capable of delaying one water claim for years could likely find some way to delay or discredit a second one, filed by an unmarried young woman with no standing beyond a dead mother's handwriting. She began instead, quietly and patiently, to verify what she could of her mother's findings, walking the desert washes with the same careful eye Ines had taught her as a girl, noting for herself the telltale signs of water moving beneath the surface that her mother's letter described, and seeking out Otis Pruitt, the land office clerk who had sold her the Windmill parcel, to ask, as casually as she could manage, whether he had any memory or record of a water survey filed under her mother's name. Otis, after some hesitation, and clearly some discomfort at the question, admitted that he recalled the filing, that it had indeed come through his office, and that he had personally watched it languish, unprocessed, in a drawer, for the better part of a year, on instructions from a supervisor who was, by that point, long since retired and gone from the territory. Instructions Otis had never fully understood, but had not felt it his place to question. He did not know what had ultimately become of the original filing, whether it had been lost, destroyed, or simply buried so deep in bureaucratic neglect that it no longer existed in any retrievable form, but his account, given reluctantly, and only after Delphine pressed gently but persistently, confirmed enough of her mother's letter to convince her the survey and its suppression had been real. Word of Delphine's inquiries reached Reuben Sharp within weeks, carried by the same small-town channels that carried everything in Cactus Rim, and he called upon her at the Windmill site himself, on a hot, still afternoon, polite in his usual clipped fashion, but with an undercurrent of watchfulness Delphine had not seen in him before. He offered, without her having raised the subject at all, to purchase the Windmill parcel back from the company's own funds for a sum considerably beyond what she had paid, framing it, with practiced smoothness, as an act of corporate goodwill toward a young woman who had suffered enough hardship without clinging to a worthless patch of desert. Delphine, who had learned patience from her father and a careful eye for hidden worth from her mother, understood precisely what was being offered and precisely what it was meant to prevent, and she declined as politely as the offer had been made, telling Sharp only that she had grown attached to the land and did not wish to part with it. His composure did not crack in that moment, but something in his manner cooled considerably, and what followed in the weeks after was not open hostility, for the company preferred subtler methods, but a slow tightening of Delphine's circumstances, the mercantile growing suddenly reluctant to extend her the modest credit she needed to purchase supplies. A neighboring rancher who had once offered her occasional work finding, quite suddenly, that he no longer had need of extra hands. Rumors, drifting through town, that the Colton girl had taken to wandering the desert alone, talking to herself, unsettled by grief, in ways that made decent folk uneasy around her. There were smaller cruelties too, the kind that left no evidence anyone could point to, but wore at a person all the same. Conversations that fell silent when Delphine entered the mercantile. Neighbors who had once waved warmly, now offering only tight, distant nods. The particular loneliness of watching a community she had known her whole life grow quietly wary of her presence. She bore it the way her father had taught her to bear hardship, without complaint, and without the satisfaction of letting anyone see how deeply it cut. Though there were nights, alone in her lean-to, with only her mother's letter for company, when she allowed herself to wonder whether pursuing the truth was worth the isolation it seemed determined to cost her, whether it might be easier, after all, to accept Sharp's offer, take the money, and start over somewhere the company's reach did not extend. But she thought of her mother's careful, urgent handwriting, of a woman who had spent 2 years patiently reading a desert that gave up its secrets slowly, and only to those willing to look long enough. And she thought of her father's silent, steady labor, the way he had kept working the land year after year, without complaint, even as grief pressed down on him. And she decided, sitting alone beneath the windmill's motionless blades with the desert stars spread thick overhead, that she would not let her mother's discovery die a second, quieter death, simply because the truth proved inconvenient to those who profited from its burial. She began, carefully, and without announcing her intentions, to build a case sturdy enough to withstand whatever resistance the company might muster, seeking out the valley's older ranching families, several of whom remembered Ines Colton's water-reading reputation from years before, and were willing, once Delphine explained what she had found, to add their own recollections and modest resources toward hiring an independent surveyor from outside the valley, a careful, unaffiliated man named Walter Griggs, who spent the better part of 2 weeks confirming, through modern instruments Ines had never possessed, that the aquifer her mother had identified through patient observation alone was not only real, but even more substantial than her original survey suggested. Delphine used what remained of her father's estate, modest as it was, along with contributions pooled quietly from a handful of sympathetic ranching families who stood to benefit enormously if the claim succeeded, to file a new water rights petition with the Territorial Land Office, this time accompanied by Griggs's professional survey, her mother's original hand-drawn map as supporting evidence, and a formal request that the petition's history, including its earlier suspicious delay, be reviewed by the territorial authorities in the capital, rather than left to the discretion of the local land office alone. The company did not take this challenge quietly. Cornelius Ashby himself traveled to Cactus Rim for the first time in years, calling a public meeting at the town hall, ostensibly to discuss the valley's ongoing water disputes, but plainly intended, as everyone in attendance understood, to discredit Delphine's claim before it could gather further momentum. Ashby stood before the assembled ranchers that evening and painted Delphine as a grieving, overwrought young woman chasing her dead mother's fanciful notions at the expense of the valley's genuine economic stability, warning that an unproven water claim, if pursued recklessly, could throw the whole region's carefully established water arrangements into costly, protracted legal chaos that would ultimately harm the very small ranchers Delphine claimed to be helping. It was old Hiram Castellan, one of the valley's most respected and long-established ranchers, who rose first from the gathered crowd to say plainly that he had known Ines Colton personally, had trusted her water-reading gift more than he trusted any company survey, and that he, for one, intended to stand behind her daughter's claim, regardless of what pressure the company chose to apply. He was followed by several other families, emboldened by Griggs's independent confirmation of the aquifer, and then, to the visible discomfort of the company's representatives, by Otis Pruitt himself, who stood, hands trembling slightly, and confirmed publicly what he had earlier told Delphine privately, that Ines Colton's original survey had indeed been filed over a decade before, and had been deliberately left to languish on instructions he had never fully understood, but now believed, given everything since, to have come from company pressure applied through channels above his own modest position. Delphine spoke last, laying out her mother's letter, the survey, and Griggs's confirming data, with the same calm, unhurried precision her mother had brought to reading the desert itself, refusing to raise her voice, even as Ashby's carefully maintained composure began, for the first time that evening, to show visible strain. The meeting ended without formal resolution, for the territorial authorities alone held power to settle a water rights claim. But something in Cactus Rim shifted decisively that night, the way desert ground shifts after the first real rain of a long drought, and within 2 months, following the territorial office's review of both the original suspicious delay and the new, thoroughly documented petition, Ines Colton's water claim was formally recognized and registered in Delphine's name as her mother's heir, granting the valley's participating ranching families protected, shared access to the aquifer through the 3 windmill sites her mother had originally identified. The Cactus Rim Land and Cattle Company did not face criminal charges, for the original obstruction was too many years old and too difficult to trace definitively to any single decision-maker. But the public unraveling of its quiet water rights campaign cost it dearly among the very ranching families it depended upon for goodwill and future business. And within the year, Cornelius Ashby was recalled by his eastern investors to a different territory entirely. His influence in Cactus Rim ended as quietly and completely as it had once seemed unshakable. Delphine did not use her renewed windmill site or her mother's confirmed water claim for her own enrichment alone, though she could have, as the claim's rightful holder, charged the valley's other ranchers considerable fees for access to water they desperately needed. Instead, Working alongside Hiram Castellan and several other established families, she helped establish a cooperative irrigation association, modeled closely on the shared vision her mother had described in her final letter, granting every participating homestead fair and equal access to the aquifer's water in exchange for modest shared maintenance costs, finally delivering, more than a decade late, the very security Ines Colton had died attempting to secure for her neighbors. She rebuilt the old windmill herself, replacing its rusted blades and rotted platform boards with salvaged and purchased lumber, and had a small brass plate mounted at its base, reading only that the mill and the water beneath it were given to the valley in memory of Ines Colton, who found what others could not see and left it, patiently, for someone willing to keep looking. She had been 24, and utterly without a home, when she counted out $2.90 for a broken windmill on barren ground nobody else wanted, and there were those in Cactus Rim who had called it the last foolish act of a grieving girl. But Delphine Colton had learned, first at her mother's side, reading the quiet language of the desert, and then in the patient work of finishing what her mother had begun, that ground others call worthless is rarely as barren as it appears, that water and truth alike move steadily beneath the surface toward those patient enough to keep looking for them. She had not gone looking for a lost fortune or a decade-old vindication when she climbed into that windmill's rafters. She had been looking only for scrap lumber to shore up her shelter, and had found instead her mother's own voice, waiting patiently to finish a conversation death had interrupted 11 years before. What she restored in the end was never really about the water, or even about her own survival, though both mattered enormously to a young woman with almost nothing left. It was about a mother's unfinished promise to her neighbors, kept at last by the daughter she had trusted to keep it. It was about a valley remembering that the ground beneath its feet, like the people walking upon it, is never quite as used up as the world assumes. It was about the quietest, most overlooked things: a broken windmill, a hidden letter, a grieving daughter with $3 in her purse, sometimes carrying within them everything needed to make a whole community whole again. Thank you for spending this time with Delphine Colton's story, and with all of us here. If this story moved you, we would be grateful if you shared it with someone who needs a reminder that hidden worth is still worth, even when the world has long since stopped looking for it. We would love to hear from you in the comments. What is a time you found value in something others had already written off? A person, a place, or perhaps something as small and forgotten as an old windmill, standing alone in the desert. We read every story you share with us, and we are always glad to have you here. Until next time, stay close.